Welcome to Conversations on the Future of Democracy, a virtual series sponsored by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. I'm John Haskell, director of the Kluge Center. The center's mission is to bridge the worlds of cutting-edge scholarship and policymaking. Today, our guest is J. Stephen Morrison, a leading authority on pandemics and senior vice president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also director of its Global Health Policy Center. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
It's great to have you here. I was wondering if you could put in perspective for us what's happened in the U.S. so far with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, it's been a remarkable transformation that's happened. I mean, keep in mind, we're in the first week of May, in the first week of March in the United States. I think we had fewer than 70 cases, confirmed cases of COVID-19. There may have been one or two fatalities at that point. Here we are, 8 weeks later. We have 1.2, almost 1.2 million cases here in the United States, fully a third of the global caseload. We're approaching 70,000 dead, and we have 30 million people on unemployment. That's a haunting tableau. And we're not over. It's a persistent outbreak. We have 30,000 infections per day. We have 2,000 fatalities per day. So we've gone through a period of shelter in place, social distancing across the country that took different forms in different places. But at one point, everyone was under some form of shelter in place for some period of time, hopefully in most cases, long enough to begin to disrupt transmission. And now we have a number of states that are rolling back those controls and attempting to go back into to allow businesses and schools and normal life to begin in a careful and incremental way to come back in. Social distancing, I believe, it's the only real tool we have at the moment. We have no vaccine, we have no therapies. It's been reasonably successful, I think, in the United States. I think we lose sight of the fact that it did, in most instances, certainly not in New Jersey and New York, but in many instances up to now, I'd say the District of Columbia is one case too, and neighboring areas of Maryland, Virginia, it has dampened the curve. It has stretched out the outbreak. It's had the effect of beginning to minimize the risk of overload of our health systems and allow us more time to begin preparing. But now we're in a kind of confused transition point where we're not sure quite what level of social distancing and caution we should be exercising, what should be reopened, how fast, on what conditions. So it's a somewhat confusing period. We have protests gaining momentum as well, but still a lot of concern coming from both the public health and the economic side of the equation on how do we take all of that into consideration and along with the emotional well-being of Americans and get the best results with the safest outcomes.
Well, how do you evaluate the compliance level of Americans, maybe in comparison to some other countries or in comparison to when we've been asked for sacrifices in the past?
Well, I think that in America, the compliance process was very swift and in the initial phases was universal. It was remarkably orderly, calm. It was done largely on voluntary basis. You had orders issued by governors and by mayors and the like, but it was not highly coercive. It was not authoritarian. It was done in a respectful way of people's democratic and civil liberties, and Americans conformed. They complied, and I think that was a very encouraging sign of the consensus that people in America had formed about the need to do this in order to protect life. There would be sacrifice, of course. But if you were able to do this and by sheltering in place, minimize the risk of infection and slow the transmission, bend the curve, which we have done in our country, that was an achievement. Now, patience is beginning to wear out in many places. The pain that people experience simultaneously in the economic dislocations obviously is becoming intolerable for many people. And that we haven't had I don't think we've had a situation where we've had such stark choices. We had to, in order to have the impact of disrupting transmission, we had to, on an open basis, crash our economy, and that's startling. That's profound, and we've done it, and people are still largely in concurrence that this is the right thing to do. The Pew poll that came out at the end of last week showed pretty durable, pretty durable consensus of the majority of Americans standing behind these measures. I think all of that's pretty remarkable. But I also think I'm not surprised that we see opposition forming up, an amalgam of people who are wanting to get back into business, who are anti-gun, who are anti-vaccine activists, who are libertarians, fringe libertarians, who are gun rights folks. There's this amalgam of people that are coming forward in protest. At first, I thought they wouldn't get much traction and momentum because of what we just said, that the American people are largely standing in favor of these measures. But they're getting more momentum. They're getting support, rhetorical support from the White House, and they're getting media attention in a significant way, which feeds their action. And one thing that I saw this weekend that was very disturbing is the first episodes of violence involving these actors confronting those who are still in favor of the public health.
So, as I think you probably know, Washington Post columnist David Von Dreely has himself suffered from the infection. He has recovered. He described us as in a situation of having two pandemics. One of them is COVID-19, the other one unemployment. Yes. That's kind of what you're getting. What we're seeing, as you say, the catastrophic situation with the economy that is probably just the beginning, right?
Well, we don't know. I mean, there's plenty of reasons to be deeply concerned. We don't, we've gotten through this first phase, but it's just the first wave. And even then, that first wave is not over. There's a lot of these controls are being removed prematurely on the hope that everything will be okay, but it may turn out to be wrong. And certainly, there's no reason for believing that this has seasonality to it, that you're going to see a significant dip. I think you're going to see persistent infection rates. I said earlier, 30,000 a day, 2,000 deaths. Okay, that may dip to 20,000 in the summer, but we're still talking about persistent infection and persistent fatalities, persistent extreme illness. And we get into the fall, we're going to have another wave. The epidemiologists are now speculating on what that will look like. And there's different scenarios that are being posited, some scarier than others. But the reality is we're living with this. It's not going away. The percentage of Americans who have immunity at the end of this wave, when we get into August, let's say, certainly no more than 5% of Americans, and I think probably far fewer than 5% of Americans, which means that the other 95 or 98% of Americans are there. They have no immunity, and the virus could find them. And so it's going to keep coursing through our society and other parts of the world. Until we get above 50 to 60%, we're not going to have herd immunity. And until we get to a vaccine, we're not really going to be able to fix this problem. So we have to figure out how we cope between now and getting a vaccine, or now and getting to herd immunity.
So you raised the herd immunity question. A couple questions about that. One of them is Sweden's approach is getting a lot of attention. It's sort of like a fast track to herd immunity in a sense by staying relatively open. And my other question related to that is, Can you sort out for us what's magical, or if there is anything magical about a 60%? Everybody says 60% herd immunity is what you should go for. I'm curious about those two questions, Sweden and the 60% threshold.
Well, Sweden is a very interesting case because for a few reasons. Um, the Anders Tegnell, who is the chief medical officer in Sweden, has exceptional autonomy and authority in setting policy in that country, in their system. And he has come forward and said, in our society, in Swedish society, we are of a sufficient scale and we're of a sufficient level of consensus and trust that we don't need to go into an ordered lockdown. We can have people will conform if they're given the correct guidance, they will conform. We don't need to shut down businesses. We can amend practices. We need to put our highest focus on protecting those who are most vulnerable, the elderly, those with underlying conditions, those that are health providers, those that are service providers in high contact. Protect those people, have the other parts of the population understand what's at stake and convince them and win their agreement to change their behavior, and we can get through this without having the disruptions. And what's interesting about Sweden is that their case rates, their case counts, their fatality rates are much lower than almost all of the other advanced economies in Europe, North America, obviously, and they're doing quite well. That doesn't mean that they're not subject to these outbursts. They're subject to high fatality among the elderly, and they have a mixed approach. Basically, they've imposed some controls over certain types of activities and businesses. It's not across the board no shelter in place. It's a mixed system that they have, and they are monitoring it closely, and they freely admit that if things don't go well, they're going to have to change course, and they've made various adjustments to that. That's interesting because it stands at one end of the spectrum of a small society that's wealthy, has a good health system, has good health coverage. We don't have lots of people who fall outside of the system for reasons of poverty or their employment or their like. So you have a system that's intact, it's strong, it's respected, and you have a small society. And then you look at New Zealand, and New Zealand is an island, a series of islands. It has very strong leadership under Jacinda Ardern, the prime minister. What they did was at the other end of the spectrum. She said to her population, we're going to go into a very, very strict shutdown, and everybody's expected to live by that. And at the end of that shutdown, we will have broken the back of transmission, and we will then move to elimination of the virus from our country. And after that, we'll reopen and we will deal with the infections that appear in a very aggressive way. And so she came at that problem from the other end, the elimination, the total shutdown for 21 days. And she was able to win compliance because she, like those in Sweden, she had the trust and respect of her population. And she communicated clearly, and people complied with this. And plus, it's a small population. It's an islands nation, which made it easier. So there are possibilities of success on either end of the spectrum in the approaches taken, which is quite interesting. If you, however, are like us, a very large country, 330 million people, and we miss the ball at the early stages, we don't see the gravity of the problem. The virus gets way out in front of us. We're playing catch up and we're intervening very late and in an incomplete fashion. You face a totally different dynamic in trying to get this under control.
But you said it yourself that New Zealand is islands, so that if they need to, they can just not let people in.
Right.
And that's not so easily done in Europe or here in the United States, of course, which makes a big difference.
Right.
So what's the key to the 60% rule that people are looking for on herd immunity?
It's, John, the estimates of what's required for herd immunity vary according to the transmissibility of the virus or the disease. In other words, measles, which is highly contagious, uh,
Hmm.
you need a herd immunity of I believe it's over 90%. An upper respiratory, a coronavirus, an upper respiratory, they're using this number of 60%. My first impression was that you were going to need to get higher than that, but that's a number that's now used by many of the world's leading experts who know much more than I do. But I think it varies according to the nature of the virus, the transmissibility of it, as
So,
to
so the yeah the switching gears a little bit to the CDC and the public health campaign that we've all been exposed to about washing hands and all that. How effective do you think that has been? Are people understanding that? Uh, obviously that ties to the compliance issue that we addressed before. I'm curious how you, as an expert in this area, evaluate what the CDC has put out there for us.
well, um, the CDC is sort of the gold standard of public health expertise worldwide. Um, it has 20,000 epidemiologists and other technical experts. There's no other institution like that in the world. It sets many of the standards, and it's charged with putting forward guidance and providing technical support to states and municipalities. It does international work. It's had a tough ride in this particular instance because it got off to a very bad start on the testing. It was not the only institution that failed in trying to get a test organized and out the door in a rapid fashion, but it was one of the key institutions, and it's had a tough time. It's been somewhat marginalized. It hasn't been giving weekly or daily press briefings, which is very unusual. It's sort of been folded into the White House task force. Dr. Redfield, the director of CDC, does appear at the task force meetings, but not as regularly. But they remain vitally important. They may remain vitally important in any number of ways, simply because they are the agency with the greatest expertise on pandemic outbreaks and infectious diseases, and they have that depth, and so we'll continue we will continue to rely upon them, and I would hope that they will come out of this experience strong in institutionally.
You referred earlier to a kind of a new normal that we'll be facing that may extend for quite a long time. So if you were to put your clairvoyant hat on and you were to think about what are we going to be facing as we get closer to the holidays this year or into next year, assuming the likelihood that there won't be a vaccine.
Well,
Lifeline.
if we believe there's going to be persistent infection and extreme illness and fatalities until we get to um, some therapies that will reduce the morbidity and mortality of the virus, but then most importantly, getting to a vaccine. Between now and that point, um, we will struggle to reopen and get back into the workplace and back into school and the like. But it's going to be of a different kind. I mean, obviously, the risk estimation, the risk involved will be require a very careful calculation around what is acceptable and not. And social distancing will be embedded into the workplace and into the churches and into schools and the like. And wearing of masks will become much more commonplace, although that's sort of gotten caught up in our culture wars over all of this as well. The masks. Um, so hand washing, I think, will be much more routine. I think that young people will will see this as a foundational experience in their lives. I worry a great deal about how disruptive this is going to be for our economic prospects and for people's career paths, and and how do people cope with this? Because with this level of unemployment, disruption to schooling and the like, you're going to have a generation that's going to face unprecedented level of problems, at least for a period of time on the economic side, and that will carry with it a lot of stress, and mental health issues are going to be big, and people are going to be changing their calculations around how they think about their lives and their careers.
Mhm. Let's pivot to the relationship that we have, the U.S. has with China. Uh, there's a bit of a blame game going on there. What's your take on it?
Well, I think it's, before this pandemic appeared, we were in a complicated confrontation with China as a geostrategic rival. And we had designated that rivalry as the lead element of our national security strategy. And we ran hot and cold, right? We were engaged in confrontations. We were engaged in conciliations. A lot of it was around IP, intellectual property. A lot of it was around trade terms. A lot of it was around security, in particularly in Asia on the water. Um, and so now you introduce this a pandemic, and it emanates originally from Wuhan, from Hubei province. So it begins in China, and then it spreads, and the place that is now the 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 epicenter is us. It's the United States. So the first epicenter was China. Now the epicenter is us. You said about a blame game. Yes, there's been a lot of rhetoric back and forth about trying to ascribe blame to the other side for the for this problem besetting the globe. And I think it's pretty clear that on the China side of things, for the first 6 weeks or so that the virus was known in Wuhan, it was in the late part of 2019. It was covered up for local party official purposes, for bureaucratic and power reasons within Hubei, largely. We don't know the full story. When it was disclosed on December 31st to WHO and the rest of the world, there was there was a slowness afterwards in sharing epidemiological data and specimens. The Chinese did share the genetic sequencing data around January 10th and 11th, which was very important in people getting busy on vaccines and therapies. There was a back and forth. The period of January is a source of great controversy right now, where the US is alleging that the Chinese did all sorts of things and that WHO did all sorts of things. Many of these aren't substantiated, these charges, or they're subject of great debate. Um, I think it's taking us away from this blame game, is taking us away from the huge challenges that lie right in front of us. Those countries that have gone through this epidemic through one cycle in Asia, in Europe, ourselves, Canada, we all face a risk of rebound. We all face a risk of rebound. We all don't have adequate systems for surveillance, detection, and response to those outbreaks. That's one set of problems. We know that the pandemic is spreading very quickly into low income countries and very populous lower middle income countries that are unprepared, and that this is already causing major malnutrition and acute food shortages, and it has the potential of really ripping through refugee populations, places in conflict, dense urban settings with very little social distancing possibilities, very weak health systems. So we have that coming forward as a very dangerous phase, which requires an international mobilization. And then the third thing I'd say is the R&D agenda is just huge. If we're going to get to a vaccine, there's 100 vaccines under review. If we're going to get therapies, there's over 200 therapies being explored. We need to make sure they're safe, effective, and they've been put through the trials. We need to accelerate the delivery, manufacturing, allocation. There are huge issues of equity and access there. As once we get to having this, if you imagine a two-stage vaccine requiring 14 billion doses, you can imagine, how do you organize the manufacturing and financing of that? And how do you arrange for the equitable distribution of that? Everybody's going to need it. You can't imagine just having a couple of the wealthiest and most powerful countries grabbing the supply and leaving the rest of the world outside. That's no solution. And it would just lead ultimately to the reimportation of cases into those most powerful countries. So we have huge challenges in front of us. The World Health Organization remains essential in reaching solutions in all of those three areas that I just mentioned. Those that are at risk of rebound, low and lower middle income countries that are now taking it on the chin and in great danger, and then moving the R&D agenda.
I wanted to commend to our viewers a piece you've written that's available on the csis.org website on WHO and some of the challenges the U.S. Has made about the WHO. What I was particularly struck by was in the latter half of the piece, you go into practical steps as to how we might be able to repair our relationship with the WHO. And maybe you could speak a minute or two about that.
Okay, thank you. The Trump administration suspended support to WHO on April 14th and has continued to make level charges against WHO, most of which are baseless, some of which are legitimate. The WHO, I think, has been shocked at this. The United States finds itself very isolated. The other 6 G7 member states have made very clear they object strenuously to the actions that Trump has taken. African leadership are united in their resistance to this and their objections. Bill Gates, President Carter, and on have been very vocal in saying this. I think that there should be a way out of this. WHO is too important. We're in the middle of this pandemic. We need them to be on the field. And the U.S. support WHO is very important on multiple levels. And so my thinking has been, why not look to what happened during Ebola when we had controversy over WHO performance? There was an interim review that started after the worst had passed in the first phase, and that proved to be very constructive and helpful. Why not think about that? I also have argued that the Trump administration, which finds itself very isolated, should dissociate what the WHO performance is from its very correct concerns about China's behavior. These are two separate issues. They cannot be conflated. Take the compartmentalize the WHO piece and deal with it on practical grounds. I felt that the G7 member states should be quietly weighing in with the administration, not yelling at them publicly, quietly weighing in, saying, let's find a solution. Senators, both Republican and Democrat, who care about these issues, should take the temperature down and begin also communicating quietly to the Trump administration that it's time to find some face-saving measures to get this back on track and we can move ahead. I think he's made his point to his base that he is going against, striking a blow against multilateralism. Okay, that we understand that. Now what next? Let's move ahead. I do think that these issues of attacking China and attacking WHO are tied to the election campaign. They resonate in America. There's very anti-China sentiment among Americans of all political stripes we've seen. It's always convenient to strike at UN agencies like WHO, but we need to move beyond this. That would be my plea to the White House, to the G7 leadership, and to Democratic and Republican senators who can help think this through. Thank you.
Steve, we appreciate very much your time today, and we wish you the best. I know you're very busy and on demand. And again, we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It's been a real pleasure to be with you today, and I really appreciate everything that you do at the center and for putting a spotlight on this issue. It's very kind of you and very important.
Thank you.